Good day, and today we're going to look at Victorian England in reference to Victorian literature. Now, Victorian England is around the time of Queen Victoria, so we're looking at the dates 1832 to 1901. So when we look at this view of 19th century London, it shows the darker side of progress. The Industrial Revolution is definitely at its height, but with the pollution and the overcrowding, it seems to be a bit of a darker time of progress. Now, we call this the Victorian age because of Queen Victoria, and you see her on the left here as a young girl, and you see her much later in life as the Queen. Now, her reign lasted over 63 years, the second longest of any British monarch. Now, like Elizabeth I, she gave her name to this period of British history and literature. Now, Queen Victoria was a popular queen, the first to take residence inside of Buckingham Palace. Now, she spoke English, French, German, Italian, and Hindustani. She became queen when the monarchy was unpopular with the people, but she won them over with her modesty, practicality, personality, and style. Now, when it comes to marriage, Victoria met Prince Albert, a cousin who was a minor German prince, when she was 16. 4 years later, at age 20 and already queen, she fell in love with him and soon married. Some believe he married her only to gain social status. However, their marriage seemed to be quite a happy one. They parented 9 children. Unfortunately, he died in 1861, and from that time on, she dressed only in black. For the next 40 years until her death, she ordered that a fresh suite of clothing be laid out for him daily. And she started the tradition of a bride wearing white at her wedding. So here we see Queen Victoria at the age of 20, just when she's about ready to get married, and then her as being a widow much later in life. So when we look at the Victorian era in the fact of history and how it affects literature, we have quite a few positives. After all, Queen Victoria turned England into the world's leading military and economic power. And because of this, there's also a period of intense change, not just in the United Kingdom, but throughout her colonies as well. For example, you're going to see a fixture on the railroads. The postal system is going to become very much the way of getting information out. There's also going to be several improvements in medicine and sanitation. You have government-supported schools for all. More people could now vote. There were several political reforms. Because of this being the Industrial Revolution, you're going to see an increase in industry and a decrease in dependence on agriculture. And because of the increase in industry, you're also going to see an increase in city populations. Now, of course, there are some negatives that come along with the Industrial Revolution. Changes to traditional British society were sometimes quite disturbing. For example, with that increase in city populations, you're also going to see an increased urban poverty. There's also going to be a challenge to British Empire's power throughout foreign wars. After all, with all the colonies that they have where the sun never sets on the empire, there are going to be people who've decided they would like their freedom, or they might want what British powers control. You're also going to see women entering the workforce and workers starting to fight for power towards the end of this Victorian era as the progressive movement starts. Now, when we get into Great Britain in the 1880s, you have this social, economic, and spiritual change. For example, if we look at the British literature Jekyll and Hyde, we see what represents the sense of natural man, the free of civilizing influences of society and religion, where man can actually be what man is. We also see the height of Darwinism at this time, where it says that man has evolved from lower species. In the 1880s, you're also going to see social changes because of Freud's studies in psychoanalysis, where we're looking at our inner aspects and our inner psychology. And there will be symbolic representation of the threats of innovations in economics, science, and workings of the mind. With all the industry and all of the science that's moving so fast, there are still people who don't understand the innovations, and so because of that lack of knowledge, there can be symbolic representation of these being threats. With some historical and cultural context, you're also going to be seeing a bit of religion. For example, with Calvinism, the strict form of the Protestant religion that was founded by the Swiss reformer John Calvin in the 16th century. Along with the Victorian period, you're going to see that come back into favor. It is associated with moral restraint. It demands austerity and a grim respectability that we've come to associate with the Victorian times. You still have some leftovers from the previous time period of predestination, where there's this sense of elect that were certain people known only to God who would be granted entry to heaven. Now, appearance is an important feature of your story of Jekyll and Hyde. It is also an important feature of the Victorian period. There's a facade which conceals the reality that is often important in a work of prose. Notice how the appearance of buildings often reflect the nature of inhabitants in Victorian literature. Now, when we look at the story of, say, perhaps Jekyll and Hyde, the story is a psychological exploration of evil and the forces the reader to examine the nature of morality through its conflicting characters Jekyll and Hyde, who are, as we know, representations of different moral extremes within the same man. Now, taking a look at Victorian social classes in the time period, Victorian society was highly stratified. Social classes did not mix, and behavior, especially among members of the upper class, was expected to be exemplary at all times. Now, this would be unrealistic, and this rigid morality to upper class Londoners would lead many to live double lives. Now, by the end of the 1800s, Britain was experiencing a period of intense social, economic, and spiritual change. After many decades of this confident growth, the world powers growing in their colonies, and this sense of national self-fulfillment when it came to science and the arts. Population is also going to double in the United Kingdom, creating a demand for housing, food, and clothing. And the Irish potato famine is also going to create a flood of new immigrants, especially in the urban areas. So again, for perhaps Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this story is going to perfectly capture some readers' fears that their carefully built society was actually based on nothing. Now, one of the tropes that we get from the 19th century is that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And that could have technically been true. England was an imperial nation gaining control of countries around the world, and during Victoria's reign, 25% of the world's population was considered part of the British Empire. Now, this gives Great Britain a sense of imperialism, or the policy of extending a nation's authority through acquiring territory or by dominating their politics and economy. We also see a bit of hegemony just in case they don't really want your politics and economy. A hegemony means to dominate over groups with or without the threat of force. Now, the British Empire during Victoria's reign controlled 1/4 of the world's population, or about approximately 458 million people, and it covered 14.2 million square miles, also about 1/4 of the Earth's total land area. So now you can see what the reason is as to why the English language was at one time the language of business, law, and governments. Look at all of the pink colors on the map. That would be the British Empire during Queen Victoria's reign in the 19th century. Now, looking at half the population, social conventions for women remain similar to those of the Bennet sisters. Women were to marry and provide homes. A working class woman, if married, would be a servant, and if unmarried, could be a teacher or a governess. Many women did not marry simply because there were not enough men. This led to the creation of the phrase, redundant women. Now, legal changes at the time were to their advantage. Although women could still not vote, they had the right to retain their own property after marriage. They could sue for divorce and to fight for the custody of their children in a separation. Now, when we look at Victorian literature, it expresses a world of ideas in a culture comfortable enough with itself to ponder and debate certain things. For example, we have approximately 100 years of peace after Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 to the beginning of World War I in 1914. The Industrial Revolution is going to expand the wealth and social economy to the middle class. And by the 1860s, all men except agricultural workers had the right to vote. Between 1860 to 1900, the literacy rate from Great Britain went from 40% to 90%. And it seems like Great Britain is also obsessed with being genteel, decorous, and basically amounting to that sense of prudery, that sense of Calvinism again, where everything is supposed to be on the up and up. Now, young women of personality and charm, the Queen Victoria was influenced by the prudishness of the time. Some say the Queen often used the expression, "we are not amused," whenever a conversation took a ribald or a tacky turn. Now, language in particular reflected the uptight prudishness of the era. Since it would be improper to refer to body parts, a family at the dinner table would be embarrassed to ask for a thigh or a breast from a plate of chicken, so they used the euphemistic dark meat and white meat. Now, at the time, we also want to take a look at the Victorian poets. Now, Wordsworth said, "A poet is a man speaking to other men." So at the time, romantic poetry for the Victorian poets would have been an individual experience, and your poetry should speak of that experience. Now, Robert Shelley, a Victorian poet, expanded the role of the poet when he said, "Poets are the acknowledged legislators of the world." Poetry confirmed what the Victorians valued, or it pointed out problems in their society. Their poetry often related to society's problems or misdirection. Now, these poets questioned the cost of exploiting the earth and human beings to achieve comfort for only the rich few. A lot of times they also protested or made fun of the codes of decorum or manners, as well as the authority during the Victorian times. Now, the attitudes of the poets towards their world will change as you continue reading Victorian literature. Now, the beginning of the era is similar to the Romantic movement right before this time period. The world was orderly, and nature's beauty was a reflection of God's plan and goodness. Now, Alfred Lord Tennyson represents this beginning. His poetry assures readers that everything was part of a benevolent plan in which eventually all losses will be made right. Now, Alfred Lord Tennyson saw God in his world. He also looks to the past, to the lives of several mythical characters, to find ideals of human behavior. Now, also the Victorian era is going to create the concept of smog, which is called the storm cloud of the 19th century. Author John Ruskin describes, "The sky is covered with a greasy cloud, now rain cloud, but a dry black veil, which not ring or sunshine can pierce. Partly diffused in feeble mist, enough to make distant objects unintelligible, yet without any substance or wreathing or color of its own. It looks partly as if it were made of poisonous smoke, but mere smoke would not blow to and fro in that wild way. It looks more to me as if it were made of dead men's souls." Now, by the middle of the 19th century, other writers seemed less certain about a spiritual or divine presence in the world. Matthew Arnold writes that the sea of faith had ebbed. There was no certainty, or if there was, what was certain was that existence was not governed by a benevolent intelligence that cared for its creatures. Thomas Hardy's The Darkling Thrush, for example, is the grimmest of these questioning poems. It was written on January 31st, 1899, and marked the close or death of the 19th century. Now, Victorian authors are going to continue to reflect their social concerns in their writing. For example, in his novels, Charles Dickens attacked the hollowness, the glitter and superficiality, as well as the poverty and cruel conditions of those like Tiny Tim and the orphan Oliver Twist. Matter of fact, many of Dickens's most memorable scenes showed decent people that were neglected, abused, and exploited. Now, Dickens's last novel, Our Mutual Friend, features a family called the Veneerings. They are brand new people in a brand new house in a brand new quarter of London. Now, veneer is a thin surface layer as of finely grained wood glued to a base of inferior material. Cherry and ebony walnut veneers are used in making furniture, often instead of solid wood. Therefore, the craftsman conceals something common or inferior with a deceptively attractive outward show. Moving on to the Victorian drama, Oscar Wilde was the Victorian playwright who, like Charles Dickens, poked fun at those who were socially pushy or insincere. He makes delicious fun of the idle, often phony upper class in his play, The Importance of Being Earnest. Now, this play is called A Comedy of Manners. All in all, Victorian literature is about change and a culture's reaction to that change. The telegraph, telephone, and photography, as a matter of fact, Victoria was the first royal to have her portrait taken rather than painted, as well as the advent of the automobile and electric lighting, changed not only the way people lived, but the view of the world in which they lived. Darwin unsettled the world by offering another view of creation, while Nightingale, who founded the first modern nursing school, gave women a role model. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn a little bit more information about the Victorian period and how it relates a bit to Victorian literature. If you'd like to learn more about particular Victorian literature, leave a comment down below and let me know which Victorian pieces you'd like me to make some videos on. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed.